Good evening. To the organizers of this inaugural graduate student conference of African American Studies, what an incredible gift this convening is to all of us. Thank you for all the time and energy you've poured into conceptualizing and organizing this space amidst all your other commitments. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here when I say we are deeply appreciative for what is in many ways a clearing in the tradition of beloved's Baby Suggs Holy. In that clearing, she shouted, "Let the children come." And they ran from the trees towards her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang. The adults looked on and could not help smiling. "Then let the grown men come," she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. "Let your wives and your children see you dance," she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the women to her. "Cry," she told them, "for the living and the dead. Just cry." And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way. Laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried. Children danced. Women laughed. Children cried until, exhausted, riven all and each, lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. In the silence that followed, Baby Suggs Holy offered up to them her great big heart. She did not tell them to clean up their lives or go and sin no more. She did not tell them they were the blessed of the earth, its inheriting meek or its glory-bound pure. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine. That if they could not see it, they would not have it. "Here," she said, "in this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard." As with the clearing and beloved, I expect that we too will mix it up, laughing, dancing, weeping, and loving hard over the next days. And of course, it's truly my honor to offer just a few thoughts into the mix, reflecting on this weighty and inspired theme of mourning the needy dead, drawing upon the incredible reservoir of brilliance and creativity that floods this room, some of which I will cite directly, but most of which I intend to incorporate after the conference as I develop this paper in conversation with your insights to come. So let's begin. Last fall, when Niall and Heath first shared the conference theme with me, I was immediately struck by the homophone. Mourning, an expression of deep sorrow and grief, and mourning, the beginning of a day. Seeming opposites, end and beginning, death and life, peril and possibility. The act of waking up in the morning and being woke also got me thinking about the possibility of excessive wakefulness. That is, in the way that sleep deprivation is dangerous to our own health. Is there something like dream deprivation in an existential sense, where one is so focused on the present that one is unable to imagine a future? To sleep, after all, is to dream, a phenomenon that continues to garner a steady stream of scientific research, but still remains largely shrouded in mystery. Among the most relevant findings I learned while preparing for this talk comes out of a sleep and neuroimaging lab at Berkeley. Researchers there show that a reduction in REM sleep, or less dreaming, inhibits our ability to understand complex emotions in daily life, an essential feature of social functioning. Dreams, they tell us, seem to help us process emotions by encoding and constructing memories of them. And this mechanism fulfills an important role because when we don't process our emotions, especially negative ones, they say, this increases personal worry and anxiety, and as a point I'll touch upon a little later, and has a host of health effects. But for now, the point is that we don't seem to be able to adequately mourn if we do not dream, literally, but also we might consider how this relates to collective forms of envisioning. Taken together, this set of reflections centers around the various kinds of fatigue, physical, emotional, spiritual, which are an inevitable part of freedom struggle. And here I'd like to emphasize the freedom to rest, reflect, and create refuge when needed. This, I think, also connects to the process of mourning those who we're forced to lay to rest, with the need for us to find resting places while we're still alive, as we fight to change the conditions that lead to premature death in the first place. This I see as a more fundamental retreat than what's commonly described as self-care. To sustain the work ahead, we must consistently and creatively tune in to our inner reality, that is dream, even as we hone a rigorous analysis of our outer reality, that is staying woke. Christina Sharp's brilliant theorization, which you've heard referenced already, of the many dimensions of the wake and its relation to wokeness informs my own reflections. She poses the question, how does one mourn the interminable event? Sharp explains that wakes are processes through them. We think about the dead and about our relations to them. They're rituals through which to enact grief and memory. Wakes allow those among the living to mourn the passing of the dead through ritual. But wakes are also the track left on the water's surface by a ship. Finally, wake means being awake and also consciousness. The imperative that freedom struggles be both grounded and anticipatory, situated and speculative, is a consistent concern in Black studies. For example, Robin D.G. Kelley writes that we must tap the well of our own collective imaginations, that we do what earlier generations have done, dream. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. We might think of this as dream walking, understanding that a necessary counterpart to the movement is stillness. Even so, the imperative to wake up is enjoined upon us through art and social justice discourse. The caution, don't sleep, and the imperative to stay woke are echoed at every turn. Most recently, the film Get Out presents the horrors of being trapped in an inner reality not of our own making. Our consciousness as a site of captivity. And in Georgina's brilliant portrayal, we must reckon with the agony of being incarcerated in our own bodies. Her single tear, even as she smiles, is a sign of the deep mourning and yearning for freedom. In Fanon's terms, the victim of oppression is, quote, hemmed in. The first thing which the native learns is to stay in his place. Think here of the sunken place. And not to go beyond certain limits. This is why the dreams of the natives, he writes, are always of muscular prowess. His dreams are of action and of aggression. Think again of the running scene where the groundskeeper heads straight for Chris. In many ways, Get Out is a meditation on Fanon, who writes, I dream I'm jumping, swimming, running, climbing. I dream that I burst out laughing, that I span a river in one stride, or that I'm followed by a flood of motor cars which never catch up with me. During the period of colonization, the native never stops achieving his freedom from 9 in the evening until 6 in the morning. Elsewhere, he says, the oppressed exists interminably in an unchanging dream, and that the colonizer's work is to make even dreams of liberty impossible for the native. In what follows, then, I'd like to consider the theoretical import of dreaming with an embodied, reflexive account of the significance of sleep. No, please don't fall asleep, John. These reflections grow out of several personal experiences that draw out the life and death dimensions well beyond the academy. Just over 3 years ago, weeks before I interviewed for my current position, my father died from what we're not exactly sure. It could have been the H1N1 flu virus. It could have been related to long-term complications of a stroke he had 5 years before his death, but from which he seemed to recover well. But another more chronic issue, which I often nagged him about, was a lack of sleep. As a dutiful and nagging daughter, I often forwarded him articles like this, all the while knowing that simply knowing the facts about health is never enough to change behaviors that are in large part a response to environmental stressors. 3 years on, and my mother now works the night shift as a home health care worker. She sleeps, if we can call it that, in the reclining chair next to the bed of the person for whom she cares. Once again, my nagging and forwarded articles are of little consequence. After all, when I was a grad student with a toddler and newborn baby, the science of sleep was not going to help me deal with a colicky baby while writing that seminar paper by daybreak. It was during this period when I got a first-hand sense of why sleep deprivation is a form of torture, as I felt the rubber bands in my head starting to snap, a point to which I'll return shortly. Moving ahead, then, let me link these personal reflections with some of the political dimensions of sleeplessness by sharing 3 ongoing nightmares having to do with white supremacy, policing, militarism, and economic exploitation. And while I illustrate these forms of state-sanctioned violence through individual stories, that of Alyana Jones, Mohammad Jawad, and Memo Cruz, these are in fact recurring and collective nightmares that ravage and tear apart entire communities, from Detroit to Afghanistan to Tijuana. And yet it's also important to remember that these nightmares are the underside of a particular kind of fantasy around social order, global dominance, and rabid capitalism. That is to say, the dreams of some rely upon the repeated and ongoing horrors experienced by many. Beginning with 7-year-old Alyana Monet Stanley Jones, who was asleep on her grandmother's couch when in the middle of the night on May 16, 2010, a Detroit SWAT team raided her family's home looking for a murder suspect. In the process, an officer threw a flashbang grenade through the window and killed Alyana with a single bullet to the head. What's more, a reality TV crew was filming the raid for A&E. And yet, film reels notwithstanding, the case against Joseph Weekley was dismissed twice due to lack of evidence. Even as she dreamed, Alyana was forced into a nightmare not of her making. Her body snatched away and forced into a sunken place from which there is no return. During testimony, Alyana's grandmother, Matilda Jones, wept, saying, "She was only a baby, man. She was sleeping. And I told you all, let me get my granddaughter. You didn't give me a chance. Why you do this to me? I get no sleep. I'm sick as hell. I get no sleep. Flashbacks. I wouldn't wish this on nobody in the world, not even you." And while this more obvious example of state-sanctioned violence warrants our rage and solicits our grief, must also be connected to the subtler interruptions of sleep that typically go unremarked. According to the CDC, as shown here, racial disparities in sleep abound, a point to which I'll return shortly. For now, I turn to a second nightmare involving Mohammad Jawad, an Afghani teenager who was arrested in a Kabul marketplace and accused of attempted murder by a Guantanamo military commission on charges that he threw a grenade at a passing American convoy in December 2002. Jawad's family says that he was 12 years old at the time of his detention, while the U.S. Department of Defense maintains that a bone scan showed he was about 17 when taken into custody. Whatever the case, he was transported to Guantanamo Bay, a military prison where inmates are not criminal suspects nor prisoners of war, and where they are held indefinitely until trial. In September 2003, Mohammad was reportedly seen talking to a poster on the wall, after which an interrogator called for a consultation with a psychologist who was not there to ease his distress, but exploit it. The psychologist wrote, quote, "The detainee comes across as a very immature, dependent individual, claiming to miss his mother and his younger siblings, but his demeanor looks like it's a resistance technique. He tries to look as if he's so sad that he's depressed. During today's interrogation, he appeared to be rather frightened, and it looks as if he could easily break," end quotes. The psychologist, who was not identified in the notes, recommended that Mohammad be kept away from anyone who speaks his language. Quote, "Make him as uncomfortable as possible," the psychologist advised. Thank you. "Work him as hard as possible." After which, the guards placed him in isolation for 30 days and then subjected him to what's called the frequent flyer program, a torturous method of sleep deprivation. Guards yanked young Mohammad from cell to cell 112 times, waking him an average of every 3 hours, day and night, for 2 weeks straight, according to court records. Jawad testified that during these weeks, he was also subjected to blaring loud music and bright lights at all times, and military records show that he tried to kill himself by banging his head against a cell wall. Finally, after 6 years in captivity, the military commission ruled that Mohammad's confession to throwing a grenade was inadmissible because it was obtained through coercion. Jawad was repatriated in Afghanistan in August 2009. In a meeting with his lead attorney after he was returned home, Mohammad asked to see all the case files so that he can review them, to remember all those things that happened to him back there in that human cage. "Do you remember the cameras they had at Guantanamo?" he asked his attorney. "The ones in the corners of the room every time we met," he says. "I want all of that film too." As his lawyer tried to explain how security cameras work, that it's doubtful that any of the video at Guantanamo still exists, there sits Jawad, the shattered mirror, grasping to put the pieces back in order to catch sight of himself. Like Alyana, he is trapped in a nightmare not of his making, one that's also a kind of fantasy of global security and dominance. And it should come as not much of a surprise to us that some of the very same officers that terrorize Black communities, like Chicago PD's Richard Zuley, have been exported to Guantanamo, where they use the same brutal tactics to interrogate prisoners. In Chicago, Zuley's methods included shackling suspects to walls through eye bolts for several hours, allegedly planting evidence and issuing threats of harm to family members and sentences of the death penalty unless a suspect confessed. Among the confessions that Zuley coerced in Chicago was Latheriel Boyd, who served 23 years until finally, in 2013, a Cook County court found there was no evidence that could justify keeping Boyd in prison. These are interconnected horrors, in other words, which means that movements for liberation and justice must also be connected. For the third and final nightmare, I'll introduce you to Memo Cruz, who is the main protagonist in the 2008 film called Sleep Dealer by Alex Rivera. This is a dystopian world in which the US-Mexico border has been sealed while the demand for cheap labor continues. In this world, migrant workers are replaced by robots who are controlled virtually by laborers in Mexico, carrying out a variety of jobs in construction, childcare, and agriculture. These node workers must implant cables into their arms and backs in order to control the robots and insert contact lenses that act as screens, allowing them to see what the robot sees. Not only is the tech invasive, it allows unprecedented surveillance. So if a worker falls asleep for an instant, the computer wakes her up, registers the lapse, and docks her pay. Over the course of the film, Memo Cruz starts working at one such factory, which are called sleep dealers, because workers often collapse of exhaustion when they're plugged into the network too long. I'll show you a 3-minute clip to give you a sense of this world.
Cerca de la colonia donde vivía, en las afueras de la ciudad, estaban las infomaquilas, los sleep dealers.
Este es el sueño americano. Le damos a los Estados Unidos lo que siempre han querido. Todo el trabajo sin los trabajadores. José está en un matadero en Iowa y María es niñera de una niñita en Washington. Ustedes tres van a estar en una chambota en San Diego. Muchacho, enchúfate. Tu futuro empieza hoy.
Okay.
So, as the manager of this virtual reality factory explains, this is the American dream. We give the United States what they've always wanted, all the work without the workers. What's more, in the virtual reality labor depicted in the film, the eyes are the point on the body of intensive usage, and while powerful organs, they're fragile, so that node workers suffer injuries both progressive and traumatic. Memo reveals that the more I spend connected, the harder it is to see. At one point, Memo meets a group of factory workers who are blind and deemed useless by the factory and thrown out to live in the shadow of the border, evidence of the disabling effects of capitalism and technology, even in the near future where migration occurs in and through cyberspace. And we know this is not simply the stuff of science fiction. For example, if we consider the transnational structure of call centers, we observe millions of workers in India, Philippines, and elsewhere who structure their lives according to an American time zone. What one scholar calls a colonization of time. Such an approach, which constructs time as money, is based on the assumption that capitalism has a built-in clock that's always ticking. Due to time differences, most work is performed during night hours, corresponding to a time suitable to their international customers, when call center workers would normally be sleeping, which interrupts their circadian rhythm. A majority of workers are unable to sleep adequately during the daytime and hence may develop cumulative sleep debt, leading to significant deprivation associated with a host of mental and physical health issues, including an increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease as compared with day shift workers. As one call center employee reported, "When I went for this job, I was very jubilant. I thought, okay, I'll study a lot. Daytime is mine, so I'll be able to do anything." That's not possible. You're so tired. You're not able to do anything. Whatever time you have, you sleep. Even if you sleep for 10 hours, you don't get enough. You can never compensate a night's sleep. It's taxing, it's taxing. It's taxing on your social, it's taxing on your health, it's taxing on everything, end quote. Sleep debt may at first seem minor when compared to the many other forms of global inequity that rob people of vitality. But when we consider how the current economic structures steal away even the time to dream, the engineering of exhaustion in this way grows in consequence. Taken together, these three related nightmares recall Gil Scott-Heron's warning that all dreams you show up in are not your own. From Alyana to Mohammad to Memo, what will it take for people to have their own dreams? Remember now, as the latest neuroscience is slowly coming to grips with, without the ability to dream deeply, we don't have the opportunity to process complex emotions, including the ability to mourn. Likewise, Audre Lorde's caution that if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive, forces us to consider that the agony of being devoured is part of the same process by which others are being nourished. This relationality of power must stay in the forefront of our minds, that a nightmare is also a fantasy, because without reckoning with the delight produced for those who eat us alive, we can't fully come to grips with the deep investments we're up against. With that, I want to return to the importance of dreaming for liberation work along three main axes, which I'll call Soma, that is, embodied dimensions of sleep, society, or the collective and relational features of rest, and the spiritual, where ultimately we imagine and enact forms of stubborn joyfulness in and through the process of mourning. When it comes to the somatic or physical dimensions of sleep, a growing body of research underscores how important sleep is to our health, and also how racism and chronic stress impact our ability to rest. In a study titled "Every Shut-Eye Ain't Sleep," public health researchers explore the association between a novel measure of racially salient chronic stress, which they call racism-related vigilance, and sleep difficulty. Racism-related vigilance, they explain, entails the ongoing preparation for and anticipation of discrimination. They use data from the Chicago Community Adult Health Study, a cross-sectional survey designed to examine the biological, social, and environmental correlates of adult physical and mental health. Face-to-face interviews were conducted and direct physical measurements were taken from one respondent per household between May 2001 and March 2003 with a response rate of 71.8%. The study cites Fagan and Sykes' notion of vigilance, in which they explain how Blacks must be constantly aware of the repertoire of possible responses to chronic, burdensome discrimination. One older respondent spoke of having to put on her shield just before she leaves the house each morning. She said that for more than 6 decades, as she leaves her home, she's tried to be prepared for insults and discrimination in public places, even if nothing happens that day. Here again, we find an echo of Fanon, who wrote that the native's muscles are always tensed. He is in fact ready at a moment's notice to exchange the role of the quarry for that of the hunter. Returning to the particular study shown here, we learn that racism-related vigilance is an important determinant of racial disparities in sleep quality, which in turn impact a host of other health factors. This is supported by a growing literature on the sociology of sleep, which demonstrates that the relationship between stress and sleep is not simply an individual level phenomenon, that we can simply will ourselves into a peaceful slumber. In this study, titled "Putting Work to Bed: Stressful Experiences on the Job and Sleep Quality," the authors explain that they use a longitudinal and nationally representative sample to examine whether and how common conditions and experiences at work may follow workers home and impinge on their quality of sleep. Results show that frequently being bothered or upset at work is associated with poor sleep quality, and the association is not explained by stressful experiences at home. These findings are discussed in relation to the sociological literatures on work, stress, and emotion. Finally, so we went through the soma, we went through the social, we get to the spiritual dimensions of rest, which are no less politically mediated. For this, I turn to my colleague Eddie Glaude's Democracy in Black, which happens to include a chapter aptly titled "Restless Sleep After King's Dream," in which Glaude describes a kind of spiritual fatigue that cut through the bone. It involves the nastiness of life breaking through your defenses, leaving you with a sense of helplessness and a feeling of being terribly alone. In one particularly poignant section, he describes how on September 20th, 1966, in a small town in Mississippi, Dr. King would not get out of bed. Andrew Young, his closest advisor, tried everything. He used all the techniques they had learned over the course of the movement. When any of them faced debilitating exhaustion, nothing worked. This was not exhaustion, Glaude writes. King had fallen into a deep depression, forcing us to consider how King's blues color the present. Joshua Bennett's The Sobbing School poses the question, who can be alive today and not study grief? Study grief, what a phrase. Expressing in many ways what we're doing here this week. What I find so poignant in Bennett's imagery around social death is that he describes insomnia in terms that conjure the feeling of being buried alive. In one place, he says he wants a language for being born underground, gravestone quarried the moment you arrive. And in another piece, he describes sleeplessness as staring upward for hours that pass like punches to the inside of the head. This is the most lonesome anguish, which brings us back once again to the connections between sleep, violence, and vitality. Indeed, we might consider how mourning is an antidote to what Glaude describes as the constant disremembering or active forgetting that plagues this nation. Because mourning requires remembering. It's a process of putting things back together or remembering all that has been torn apart. So what does this remembering look like in practice? This, I think, should be the focus of some of our conversation the next few days. In her book, Living with Lynching, Coretha Mitchell examines how lynching plays encouraged audiences to rehearse mourning as the appropriate response to lynching by highlighting Black suffering and vulnerability, thereby emphasizing that the race is unjustly under siege. Marginalized communities and their allies, she writes, need a critical demeanor of shamelessness. A renewed cultural conversation must emphasize community truths more than contradict mainstream lies. And finally, she says, embodied practices of belonging should not be underestimated. Through art and other means, we also express a shamelessly stubborn joy, even as we mourn. And I think we really have to fight against the pressure to censor joy in an effort to appear seriously woke. Remember in the opening scene with Baby Suggs Holy, she implores those in the clearing not only to weep, but to laugh and dance. So let it be with us, all mixed up. Dance laughing, releasing the floods that are dammed up behind our eyes as we please. In closing then, I'll share one last image with you. I took this 3 days ago, just before I flew out of Mumbai to come back to Princeton. I was trying my best to stay awake on the 7-hour drive to the airport because I didn't want my internal clock to get any more jacked up than it was. So I started just taking photos of people zooming by on their motorbikes. This one is one of my favorites because look very closely. Maybe you can't see it. A little homeboy is knocked out on the front of the motorbike, speeding past. Sleep. Riffing off a line by Toni Cade Bambara where she says, not all speed is movement. We should add that it is possible to rest and move at the same time. Thank you.